One reason to be careful with blockchain is the potential vulnerability to national government regulation. And again, I think this serves as a useful reminder that very often the historical perspective is the one that gives you the most insight. So in this paper here by Eakin and Baloglu in 2017, cryptocurrencies are compared to well-kept money during the free banking era. So the historical perspective is interesting anyway. What happened was that ultimately these rival currencies were eliminated in preference to a national US dollar. Now if you draw on this historical comparison and this historical analogy, the implication would be that cryptocurrencies and other blockchain applications may ultimately be at the mercy of national government regulation. Okay, so they may not make any mistakes, they may be correct in terms of the innovations that they make. That still might not be enough for them to ultimately be successful. So if you think of Bitcoin as being one of the early pioneers, an interesting development along those lines is the introduction of a new e-franc in Switzerland. Okay, so some of these cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and some of the others might be genuinely pioneering, although it remains to be seen whether these will be successful into the longer term. Okay, and again, this is an interesting example where the historical perspective has a lot of insight. So another reason to be careful then is this potential separation between technological innovation and commercial success. Again, need for general healthy skepticism, and the historical perspective here gives you an awful lot of insight. So there's this book here by Dowd 2014. This is, I think, very useful for a very general background discussion. It suggests that Bitcoin may ultimately be unsustainable and vulnerable to being superseded by rivals. Now the comparison that is drawn by Dowd is the comparison between Betamax video versus VHS video in the video cassette market. Okay, so I don't think there's necessarily anything to split the two in terms of technological ability. In the days where video cassettes were an important thing, but for whatever reason VHS dominated over Betamax, even if it wasn't necessarily so much a greater product. So the first implication of this is that blockchain applications are likely to involve intense competition. History is replete with lots of examples where technological innovation did not lead to commercial success, so it's not necessarily automatically have a link between the two. So examples might be Betamax, as we discussed, Concorde, and TVR versus Porsche. So Porsche more successful, TVR thought to be technically a better car. So in this part we're going to talk about the economics and finance of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. So I'm going to focus upon Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in particular. Now remember that blockchain is the foundational technology and Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are just the most widespread early application of this blockchain technology. Now the other thing I ought to say here is that whilst this is titled The Economics and Finance of Bitcoin and Cryptocurrencies, whilst this is true, and this is what I'm aiming to describe in this part of the lecture, I think often the most useful part of this is the historical perspective. Okay, so the couple of examples in the last couple of slides where the historical perspective is really giving you keen insights, and there'll be some more examples coming up in the rest of this lecture. And again, very often I think it's the historical perspective that just gives you better insights and a more clear warning about some of the potential problems that you might find. Okay, so Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies is a huge topic of academic research, one that I got involved with a couple of years ago, and it's actually quite a nice surprise for me to be able to teach on something that's potentially so cutting edge and also so close to some of my own past research. So as an overview then, the academic research on Bitcoin was initially limited to law and computer science. The finance and economics literature was slower to catch up, in part due to the slow-paced nature of social science subjects. But I think it's important to sort of reflect on this, and again, Bitcoin and blockchain is going to be a multidisciplinary subject, bigger than any individual discipline. So a review of the embryonic economics of finance literature is contained in my paper there, published in 2016. One thing I wanted to really drive home here, and with as much humility as possible, is that there was some luck involved in this, and though this is a prize-winning paper, the nature of the subject means it dates very quickly. So when we published the paper, we looked at the two largest cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin and Ripple. Ripple was actually previously the second largest cryptocurrency, and it was overtaken by Ethereum within a week of the paper being accepted by publication. So this did drive home to me just how fast-paced this subject is. Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are obviously interesting in their own right, but it's also important to reflect here in this lecture that they are also interesting in economic and financial terms, and as part of that they are widely studied. So one question that has enthralled economists is the economic definition of Bitcoin. Is it a genuine currency or a speculative asset? So if you ask this question, is Bitcoin primarily a speculative asset or a genuine currency, to a certain extent that may be independent of the founders' original intentions. They may have intended to build a genuine currency, but is it really? So historically, the prices of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies have fluctuated dramatically. Other cryptocurrencies have collapsed completely. Bitcoin prices have variously fluctuated between, it says there, $6,000 and $20,000. I think it's gone even further now, $6,000 to $30,000 over the last 3 years. Now, I would argue as an expert on bubbles that the absence of an equivalent of the Bank of England makes dramatic boom-bust episodes possible, and thus makes cryptocurrencies interesting from a finance and economic perspective, but also very dangerous. I had a paper published on a model of this in 2018. There's a further suggestion in Yermak 2013 that various aspects of cryptocurrencies are inherently speculative. Okay, now one thing here is that if all of a sudden the price of Bitcoin is going to increase by, say, 4 or 5 times, then it's necessarily extremely volatile, not well suited to everyday. But how things should work, which is possibly different to the reality. So the two major cryptocurrencies were, at least at one stage, Bitcoin and Ripple, though there have been suggestions that innovations made by large US institutions may ultimately make Ripple obsolete. Bitcoin was designed with digital mining processes intended to enforce a scarcity constraint akin to the role that precious metals played when you have a currency backed up by either gold or silver. So even if this mining process works, another important lesson from history, historically this separation of store of value and money creation led to debt deflation cycles in national currencies, and it's possible that these problems could reoccur with Bitcoin. So alongside this, it's not necessarily clear what exactly these things are intended to do. So Ripple was primarily intended to serve as a medium of exchange and a distributed payment system rather than a digital dollar. So in English, what I think that means, it was primarily intended to convert between prices in two different currencies rather than to be something they actually sort of spend in the shop somewhere. And one thing that's important here is that the volatility of Bitcoin prices, say, and the actions of large financial institutions or national governments may render these original aims moot. So one thing that's very important to emphasize here is that there are all sorts of routes to speculation and speculative bubbles whenever you're dealing with new technologies. A classic example of this would be Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. So the thinking would be that speculation is inevitable whenever new technologies are involved or whenever new investors enter a market. And with cryptocurrencies, you've potentially got both ingredients together. So the comment is made by Yermak in 2013 that cryptocurrencies are inherently speculative by their construction. So the thing that they emphasise, which I would also emphasise, is this lack of a central governance structure. So there's no equivalent of the central Bank of England to second guess. So there's a limited way in which bubble effects can be dampened down. Other things that Yermak mentioned, which I wouldn't necessarily have thought of: cybersecurity risk, low levels of initial adoption. How do you interpret Bitcoin prices? I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, and the compatibility of different Bitcoin exchanges. So alongside that, I think that some of the original Bitcoin exchanges, the infrastructure wasn't perfect and they were vulnerable to cyber attack. So as an example of this, one thing that currencies are often intended to do is serve as a unit of account. Now the example of this would be, suppose that one Bitcoin is worth £6,000. How many Bitcoins would you need to buy, say, a coffee, a pizza and a pint of beer, or a family car? Now the first thing to say is that I haven't got the 6,000 timetable in my head, so this is sort of quite tricky. It's definitely a calculated job to calculate the price of, say, a coffee or a pizza and a pint of beer in Bitcoins. You might be able to have a decent go of calculating the price in your head of the family car in Bitcoins, because that's a larger item. Okay, so there's some element of how do you interpret vanishingly small fractions of a Bitcoin. Also, I think the current market price of Bitcoins as I record this is about £20,000. So in the space of a few months, the price of a Bitcoin has nearly quadrupled, and so necessarily therefore prices in Bitcoins would be very hard to interpret and could move very, very dramatically over a short time. So one question that I wanted to ask here, a little bit of whimsy: how do you legally befuddle an economist? So no hard drugs are involved here. What you could do is just ask them to define money. Okay, so I'm not aware of a formal and complete definition, but a useful currency has to variously function as a store of value, a unit of account, a medium of taxation payment, so almost just tokens that you pay your taxes in, and also something that can be controlled by people who are accountable. Now there's a potential problem here because Bitcoin, by its very construction, was designed to be a decentralized network with no central node of weakness. Okay, whilst that might be a good thing in some circumstances because there's no central point to attack, also necessarily means that there is a certain amount of lack of accountability. Okay, so there are these various things here that a useful currency has to function as, and it's not clear that a cryptocurrency can necessarily satisfy all of these things. So a store of value or unit of account, well, Bitcoin prices have historically been too volatile to do that. At the moment, you can't pay for taxes and other things in Bitcoin very easily either. The key thing here is it's natural to ask if cryptocurrency prices are too volatile. So if you're wanting your currency to serve as a store of value, if the currency deflates too much, your savings would obviously lose value. And what's important here, not just Bitcoin, but historically other cryptocurrency prices have suffered dramatic losses and have actually collapsed completely. Okay, and I think you could reasonably argue here that this potential for complete collapse is in part what sets apart cryptocurrencies from regular financial assets. So in terms of unit of account, so you'd have to get your calculator out if you wanted to find out how many Bitcoins you'd need to buy a pizza and a beer. So if you lived in a Bitcoin economy and prices move around so much, merchants have to keep extra Bitcoins in order to readjust if needed. So give people a change, etc. And the result would be that individual transactions would become very expensive, just due to the fact that the price of the underlying Bitcoins and the value of the underlying Bitcoins moves around too much. So irrespective of price volatility, governments and tax remains controversial topics within cryptocurrencies and open to much debate. Okay, so there's a lot going on here, not necessarily something that's going to be easy to resolve anytime soon.